Okay, good. Okay.
There haven't been any new ones.
Okay. All right.
After Rebecca's.
So, welcome
right,
everyone. We're excited to get to be talking with our contractor Reid Hensen about ranch and farm financial planning as a decision-making tool. Take it away, Reid.
Sounds good. Y'all can see the slides, I imagine. All right. Cool. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of go through a couple different or three different main topics today. Some brief kind of overview of economics, and then talk about some different budgeting tools that we kind of have to help with decision making, particularly with farm and ranch planning, but also kind of more generally as well. I got a degree from CSU in agricultural economics and taught this class at CSU. And let me tell you, it's the most dreaded class of folks, because we typically go through, when we do enterprise analysis, with lots of Excel spreadsheets and things like that. So hopefully today will be slightly more fun. I tried to put a lot of ranch pictures in it to keep folks with me. So I don't have my notes, but to do this all right, but I just wanted to acknowledge where I am and create space for kind of just acknowledging that this is a place-based industry, and we all operate on lands that are historic and have been managed and stewarded by a long history of indigenous peoples. And I'm up here in northeastern Oregon on Nimipu land, which is the Nez Perce tribe, and I hope that you all can just take a minute and think about kind of the history of your land and the history of the land that we live on today, and the indigenous practices that have taken place there over time. So like I said, today, three topics. We'll start out with economics and just some basic principles that I think are useful ideas in decision making kind of throughout life, beyond just economics as a practice. I think they really help us. Then we'll talk about enterprise budgeting, and finally we'll finish up with partial budgets. So to get us started here on the basics of economics, we'll define the difference between accounting and economics. We'll define costs. We'll talk about the bottom line. Folks use that a lot, and we'll talk about some different ideas there: optimization, margins, and marginal analysis, and then we'll get into enterprises. All right, let's kick it off. This is the fun stuff, man. I'm coming out with a bang here: accounting versus economics. But a lot of people, what I find is that people think economics is accounting, and they're different. And so I wanted to spend a minute here. So there's two types of accounting in principle, right? There's business accounting. And so the goal of business accounting is to allocate costs and revenues between enterprises and understand the financial position of a business, right? So these are balance sheets, income statements, depreciation schedules, all very important things to understanding the management of a business. And enterprise budgets fall into this category a lot of the time. But I'll explain how it ends up being economics in a minute. So then we have tax accounting, which the goal here is to maximize after-tax net returns across time. And so when you use your tax accountant's reports to make decisions on your business, you're using reports that have a different goal than proper ranch management, right? Because the goal is about minimizing your tax burden. It's not about understanding the ranch or the farm. And so lastly, we have ranch economics, right? Ranch or farm economics. And the goal there is to optimize the allocation of a scarce resource given the goals of a producer. And that's the product there is really kind of an optimized farm and ranch system. So this is just going to be a series of 10 slides of definitions. please stop me at any time if you have questions. So types of costs here. The first thing I want to go over is opportunity costs. And this is the value of a resource and its next best use. And this principle, I'm going to go into some examples here of why this is important in the next slide. So I'll leave that there. The next is a sunk cost. And this is the idea that a cost is a sunk cost if it's a cost that cannot be changed by what decisions we can make today. So that's things like if I built a fence and it has no resale value, it's a sunk cost. I've already paid it, and so it shouldn't affect my decision making today. Next, we have fixed costs. That's a cost that's fixed, at least in the short run. And then we have variable costs that vary with the units of production. And so fixed costs and variable costs we'll come back to later, but opportunity costs, let's talk about here for a second. So land values are a great example of opportunity cost, right? Because so say I have 120 irrigated acres in the Front Range of Colorado. Well, if I sell that, which this is probably a low ball estimate if it's in the Front Range, for $15,000 an acre, that's $1.8 million today. And I could reinvest that into the stock market or into mutual funds and say I get 5% returns on that. That's $90,000 a year in income. So my opportunity cost of ranching is $90,000 a year because I could, or farming, excuse me, because I could sell my irrigated acres and just be living off of those returns. But maybe I can get $1,000 an acre annually, and that's $120,000 a year in revenue. And so when we think about opportunity costs, it's understanding how could I use the capital that I have, be it land, time, whatever, in another way. And how do I, in the practice that I'm doing today, make sure that it's worth more than the other options I have on the table. The next kind of example here is time. And this is something that like ranching for profit schools talk about a lot. But if I were to pay somebody to do what I do, managing the farm, and go work in town, what would I have to pay them? And it's a great way to value time and understand kind of the opportunity cost that you're giving up. Another example of this is, say I have a kid working for me and they could go to town and make $15 an hour. Well, that kid's opportunity cost, if I'm paying them $8 an hour, is $7 an hour, right? Because they could go to town and make more money. And so when we think about trade-offs and decision making, that's something to think about. And the last one is the opportunity cost of risk. So if I have my capital tied up in similar kind of investments, land or mutual fund or whatever, is the risk higher or lower between those options? And we'll come back to risk later. Again, these are like a lot of topics. This is just like a watering hose of econ. So stop me at any point. Okay, so let's talk about sunk costs a little bit. So I just have 3 examples here. So I planted alfalfa seed last year in my field. And so my natural thought then, right, is, well, I need to keep it there. It's like an 8 to 10 year crop because I paid for the seed. Well, fancy graphic allows us to see that that's not true. When we have a sunk cost, I can't resell that seed, right? There's no resale value to the alfalfa. And so I need to be thinking about decisions moving forward. If there's another use of that land that's better than that existing alfalfa in the field, then it's really hard to do, but I need to forget the fact that I planted alfalfa and that I put that investment there, because there might be a different opportunity on the table that's going to be worth more financially or otherwise. Another example, I spent $8,000 setting up a direct marketing website. So I need to keep selling direct to consumer in order to pay that off. Well, there's no resale value in that website, I can almost promise you. And yes, Eva, every semester of grad school is a sunk cost. And so I need to keep selling direct to consumer because I already have so much money put into it. And this is such a fallacy that folks get easily caught into, right? Because it's like, I put this money there. I have to see the return. But if it's not working, it's not working. So, and then the last one, I really like this one because it happens all the time. I built this awesome permanent fence 3 years ago, and so I can't do electric, or I can't change my grazing system because I have this new fence. But if it pays to change your grazing system, then it's fine, and that's a sunk cost. So, any questions on opportunity costs and sunk costs? How they matter? Cool. Okay, so let's talk about what the bottom line means. I made this kind of interactive because I knew there wouldn't be that many of us. So I'm curious, like, what you guys, when you see the bottom line, like when somebody talks about the bottom line, what does that make you feel? What are your initial gut reactions? That was not a rhetorical question.
It's the sort of the, not all else being equal, but accounting for everything. Where are you at?
Yeah.
He's like pour everything into the kitchen sink and then see where you are.
Right. Like one metric at the bottom to be like, am I doing well or bad?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's great. And I think that's right on. A lot of times though, and something I'll emphasize kind of throughout this presentation is we can get caught in a bottom line trap. And so I know when we had Jim Pittman come, he talked about triple bottom lines. And so I want to talk about that, because when we think about managing just for this bottom number financially, we want to push ourselves to think about all of the things that are important. And especially in farm and ranch planning and farming and ranching in general, a lot of times people are willing to take negative returns, a red bottom line, because of the social or the ecological benefits of what they're doing. And we think a lot about this in economics, because there was for a long time, typical economic theory says everybody's profit maximizing, and that's what we're targeting for. But in farming and ranching, we're targeting for so much more, and we'll talk about this in a second when I talk about objectives. But this idea of the triple bottom line is having that bottom of the spreadsheet reflect not only just the financial situation, but these other characteristics as well. The problem with that is it's really hard to measure. And so when things are really hard to measure, it's really hard to compare. And that's one of the things we'll talk a lot about today. So I want to go through a quick example. So say we've got Stephanie and Bar X Cattle Company, and I apologize, all of my examples are cattle companies. Not all, I tried to include some farming things, but I think about cows a lot. So that's where we're at. But so Stephanie she's currently looking at her cow-calf business. She figured out an enterprise budget, and the bottom line is $4,000 in the red. But she loves working cattle, and she's understocked because she really wants to manage her soil health and not overgraze her property. So what does she do? Right? The natural accounting tendency is you're losing $4,000 a year. We got to fix that. And there might be things, costs we can cut, or revenue we can increase. But I'll tell you what, I spend $4,000 a year on things that I love. And so thinking about, is $4,000 in a year in the red a huge problem? It might be. There might not be the ability to do that, but it also might not be. If that value of the other two things, right, the social piece, the quality of life piece, and the love of the land and taking care of the land might be worth $4,000 a year. So that's something I just want to plant the seed in. We'll come back to that. So optimization is you heard me mention it a little bit, but this is the act of making the best or most effective use of a situation or a resource. And so I'm going to show you something that you're going to be like, Reid, shut the heck up. So this is what we do in economics, is we do a lot of complicated math to try to understand optimization problems. Let me tell you, it's really fun if you're into that sort of thing, but it's really not what we have to do. And economists should get off their high horse with all those silly letters. And really what it boils down to, what the process of optimization is we maximize some objective or minimize. You can minimize too, but typically it's going to be something like well-being or profit or land health. We have some function, and you'll hear me say this a couple times, some objective function. And that's those goals. That's that holistic context. That's the thing that we want out of this operation. And typically it's going to be a combination, right? We want profit, we want well-being, we want quality of life. And so we have this function up there at the top, and then we have to acknowledge the limits, right? We can't get everything we want all the time because we're limited in water, we're limited in time, in money, in land. And so kind of allocating those scarce resources in a way that maximizes our objective is what we mean when we talk about optimization. So the main thing that comes out of optimization is making a decision at the margin. So we have lots of different options when we're allocating those resources, and a marginal analysis, which is what we'll do with partial budgeting later, is just what happens if I push a little bit farther? What happens if I were to have another acre of land? What would happen if I were to manage just a little bit differently? Things like that. So let's go back to Stephanie and Bar X Cattle Company. So right now she raises 400 cow-calf pairs. And what would happen if she were to raise 401 pairs? What additional costs would she incur? What additional profits would she incur? What are the ecological impacts of that 401 first cow? What are the human impacts? Those sorts of things. So when we think about a marginal analysis, we're thinking, what if we just push that a little bit farther? And that's really the heart of enterprise analysis and partial budgeting is these marginal analyses to understand if I were to take something and expand it just a little bit, what would happen? These are what I call my palate cleansing slides that I put into this deck, where we've made it through one little topic. Right, we've covered a lot of ground. What questions do we have? If folks need to pee or do other things, we can do that now. This is the ranch that Kate and I are on, and this is why we do it. This is why we do numbers. I just have to put us back into the context of that. Numbers help us stay in places like this. Any questions?
Yeah, he's got, where is the ranch?
Northeast Oregon. Hey, Oliver, nice to have you here. Yeah, this is hopefully very interactive. So if you have questions that come up, feel free to like throw your camera on or interrupt me anytime.
Amazing. What part of northeastern Oregon is that? Like around the Columbia River Gorge?
No, we're actually right on the Grand Ronde River, which feeds into the Snake River, and it's actually half of the ranch is in Washington, so we're really right on the edge, just to the west of the Snake River. So
how does that work for regulations? Do you have to tiptoe between two states?
Two states, yeah, there are quite a few like different. It's funny, there's like a wildlife, we're friends with the folks who are managing the wildlife unit, and there's like one in Oregon and one in Washington, and the guy manages the one in Oregon and a different guy has to manage the one in Washington, but it's a very small community, so it's ridiculous that there has to be two different. Anyway, yeah, there's a lot of state stuff, but it's not too bad. We're dealing with wolves right now, and there's different state management things with the wolves and where the cattle are, and so that's definitely part of the deal. But it's funny how we have these arbitrary political boundaries.
Can I ask you, okay, so there was a lot of jargon. I'm trying to like fit it
Yes.
together.
Yep.
Okay, so there's the sunk costs, the opportunity costs, marginal costs, and then there's the triple bottom line, which is like trying to count for everything.
Right.
And so a cost can be
Right.
any of those kinds for any
Yes.
of those triple bottom line elements.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
Exactly.
like it like matrices out where you're not just thinking about three things now, as long as you're incorporating the social and okay. Am I following? Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason I laid it out the way I did, so revenues are a little easier, right? Revenues, but costs are harder to allocate, and we'll see that when we get into this enterprise section. And when we think about a bottom line, what we're thinking about is a contribution to our objective. And that's what that triple bottom line topic that people use. Really what that is that's saying we're managing for an objective that extends beyond just profit. And when we're understanding kind of how to make decisions on a ranch, there's like this accounting piece, which is going to be allocating costs to different enterprises and things like that. But then we need to understand how that fits into like optimizing our place for what our goals are. And so it's kind of messy right now. I'm hoping it comes together, but that was just kind of hopefully getting us on the same page with some of the jargon. Cool.
I have a question about opportunity cost.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, so an opportunity cost is like an expense that you have that will still give you money in a sense, like you will be paid for that cost.
An opportunity cost is an idea in economics where so in accounting, if I make $30,000 a year, I make $30,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
In economics, what is the main difference is incorporating opportunity costs, honestly, into between economics and accounting, because now I'm saying, okay, but if I were to take all the energy, all the capital that I needed to make that $30,000 a year doing option X,
Mm-hmm.
if I were to put that capital somewhere else, could I make $40,000 a year? And if I could, the opportunity cost of making that $30,000 a year
Mm-hmm.
is going to be $10,000, right? Because I could have been making 40, allocating that resource somewhere else.
Okay.
And so part of the idea behind enterprise budgets, right? So we have different enterprises. We have an agritourism, we have a farming operation, whatever. We have to figure out how to like the opportunity cost of an enterprise, right? So I might be able to make $60,000 running cow-calf pairs, or $100,000 using that acreage for farming.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, the farming makes me more money, but the reason I tie this all that it's not just numbers is maybe that farming is incredibly extractive, right? And now my soil, I'm tilling my soil every year to make that $100,000, and actually that's kind of a short run game. So, but the opportunity cost of that is just something that I think is important to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully what I'm doing, maybe not so effectively, is trying to push us to just think a little bit differently. And I think that these terms can help us do that. I don't expect anybody to have it all down. Took me like, however many years to kind of sort of understand it. So anyway, that was kind of rambly. Did that help to some degree?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm trying here, so we'll see if we can get somewhere. All right, I'm gonna move forward if we're all good to go. Okay, so let's define an enterprise. An enterprise is an identifiable entity within the broader business that has its own unique technology. And by technology, that can be a way of producing something. It can be it's just in a different industry really, but uses kind of the same thing, like agritourism versus farming. It can be really a whole slew of things can separate an entity. And you'll see throughout this presentation that creating good enterprise budgets is a little bit more of an art form than it is a science. And this is going to be one of the decisions that you make, how to split up enterprises. And it's not always that easy, because what we'll see is sometimes we're in a business and we're working with vertically stacked enterprises. And sometimes we're in a business working with horizontally stacked enterprises. And sometimes we're working in a business where there is vertical and horizontal stacking. And now we have to try to understand how all of these enterprises are working together and contributing to our overall objective. And so what I mean when I say a vertically stacked enterprise, this is going to be something where we're vertically integrating across the supply chain, right? So that's your direct to consumer beef operation, right? I'm raising the calf, I'm raising the stalker, I'm raising the finisher, and I'm selling the meat. So I'm owning that supply chain through multiple stages. It would be the same thing on a farm if I'm owning the grain mill, or after I sell my wheat, I'm milling it myself, or maybe I send it somewhere else to get milled, but then I'm marketing it myself. So I'm owning more than one side of the supply chain, or one piece in that supply chain of that product. That's going to be a vertically stacked enterprise. And we're going to think about those a little bit different, and I'll talk about why. And then I have a horizontally stacked enterprise, which is just going to be, I'm farming, I'm running cows, I am doing speaking events, I'm hosting some tourism. Those are going to be the horizontally stacked. And the main difference between them is going to be risk. So I want to talk about this because I think it's really important. Because I know that there's a big push right now in the industry, in like the regenerative space, to like push people to vertically integrate, which I think is great. You can own your marketing channels. You can do that. But when we vertically integrate, we compound risk across enterprises. And when we horizontally expand, we dilute risk across enterprises. And so that's going to be our main difference between vertical and horizontal enterprises, is when the vertically stacked is great because we're capturing margin across these different parts of the supply chain. Instead of being a price taker, we can be a price maker. We can set our own prices, hopefully. But also, if I have a yearling who dies after I raised it from being a calf, I never captured the revenue of that yearling. Whereas if I was selling calves, I captured that revenue after 6 months. And then I no longer am carrying the risk of owning that calf, because I've put the money in the bank, right? But when you have a yearling and then a feeder, you now have 2 years of inputs into that without capturing any money back to it. And so you're compounding a lot of risk across the supply chain. The same thing goes to grain or any other vertical integration that we do. But when we horizontally stack enterprises, we can dilute risk, because if the cattle market falls out, I have my tourism business. Or if my farming enterprise, if I don't get water that year, I have my cattle, or whatever that horizontal compilation is. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah. So does it make sense to say that vertically stacked enterprises just takes out the middleman, and then the horizontally stacked enterprises diversifies your enterprise intake or offtake?
Right. Yep. Yeah, vertically stacked, like when you hear the term sometimes like diversify your portfolio, right? In like investing or whatever, we can think of horizontally stacked enterprises as doing that, but vertically stacked enterprises won't do that.
So is it kind of optimal to do both?
It can be, you know, I won't say what is optimal and what isn't, but it totally can be depending on the situation. Because, you know, and like for vertical integration, for instance, if you're close to town, it's really easy, or not, I shouldn't say really easy, but it's a lot easier because you have your market right there. But one of the reasons we have the supply chain we do in agriculture is because of folks being so far from town. It just doesn't make sense for them to have all those relationships with the customers and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it really depends on where you are. Sometimes it should just be easier to sell at the end of the year, whatever your product is, and not track it. Or maybe it's a personality type. I know some people that should not be salespeople, but if you vertically integrate and you're selling direct to a consumer, or direct to a restaurant, or direct to anybody, you have to sell. You have to sell. And some farmers and ranchers should not sell things. Some people should not sell things. So
could you give one more example of a vertically stacked enterprise? And like, could it be like kind of a silly example?
Great. Yeah. I'm Nike. Okay. Nike is a vertically integrated business because they own the factory that stitches the shoe. They own the supply of the cotton materials. They like own the resource manufacturers. Then they own the marketing channels and the distribution, and they own various retail outlets, right? So they are tracking that shoe from it being cotton in a field to being on your foot, right? So they own all different pieces along that supply chain. And maybe they don't own all of it. Maybe you have to export and get it back, which is typically true with like meat enterprises where they don't own the fabricator, the killer fab, right? Some do, but most don't. So they give it to somebody else and then they buy it back, right? But they're still vertically integrated. All it means is you own more than one piece of a supply chain. Awesome. Okay, so we have our enterprises and we get that. Now let's analyze kind of the contribution of an enterprise to the objective of a business, right? So that's what we mean when we say enterprise analysis. And as a side note, I wanted to take a picture on our way into town today because we're in Enterprise, Oregon, and it said entering enterprise. And I should have taken a picture and I would have put it on this slide, but instead I'll tell you about it and hope that you find that amusing. Okay, so enterprise analysis, 3 steps. First, we're going to identify the objective function. You can get rid of function if you want. That's a leftover from the math, but all we're doing there is identifying the objective. It doesn't have to be profit. It needs to be measurable. And so when we think about, we could build an enterprise analysis on soil health. We could understand that the gains that we make to our soil health from each enterprise and our costs to soil health from each enterprise. And we could measure that to a degree, right? And so this is a tool that can be used for finances, but can also be used for more than that. And I think that hopefully comes across in various ways today. We also need to identify all of our enterprises. Again, this is a little bit of an art sometimes, but a lot of the times it becomes clear. And we're going to have to find kind of the fixed costs for the business as a whole. And then we're going to have to understand the variable costs for that enterprise and the revenues for that enterprise. And then we'll analyze each enterprise separately for the way that it contributes to our objective function. So naturally, I'm going to use finances today because that's where we're focused, but I do want to emphasize that we can use this for more than that. So in our identifying costs and revenues can be a tricky part of this whole deal. When we're coming up with an enterprise budget, we'll get into looking at some spreadsheets here in a second. I want to go over, I think there's 6 things here that are going to be important. The first is understanding units of production and the time horizon that we're thinking about. If I'm raising alfalfa, I might want to calculate my enterprise budget on a per acre basis. But if I'm raising animals, I might want to calculate it on a per head basis. And if I'm raising something that is produced in a calendar year, I want that to be my time horizon. But if I'm thinking about something that's a little longer term, I might want a longer time horizon. So these are all just choices that whoever is creating the budget makes. And unfortunately, there are no right answers. As in all things, in all fields, it always depends. But then we're going to estimate or recover from QuickBooks or whatever the revenues per unit, whatever unit we decide on. Then we're going to estimate and recover the variable costs per unit. And we'll go over all of this and we'll see how it looks. We'll allocate the fixed costs to the enterprise that we have. So there's a lot of things like a pickup on a farm. If I have a pickup on a farm, how on earth am I supposed to understand the variable costs for when I'm using that for my farming business, when I'm using that for my cattle business, when I'm using that for personal use? How do I do that? And so that'll be in step 4, and we'll talk about kind of one methodology to do that. Then we'll build our per unit budget for each enterprise. And then we'll build kind of a net contribution to the total budget, where we can understand and compare enterprises between them. And that is all. That's our 6 steps. So let's go through it. So and this is an aside, I just want to talk a little bit about units because it's complicated and there's a lot of questions and there's no right answers. And so that's frustrating. It can be per head, per bushel, per acre, per inch of rain, per pound of meat, total costs and revenues, etc. And so how do you choose? Well, here's 3 questions that I recommend asking. What's the market you're selling into? Like if I'm selling on a per pound basis, that might make sense to build my enterprise budget on a per pound basis. Because I might already have my costs already figured out on a per pound basis. So then I can just do it per pound, but maybe not. And maybe calculating units for cost is going to be way easier on a per acre basis. And so then I should just translate my revenues into a per acre. So it's just going to be kind of playing between these 2. And then, you know, the last question that I'll show in a minute is what's the best for comparing across enterprises. So if I do one in a per head and one in a per acre, how do I match those together? The last thing I'll say is understanding what's common is really nice because then you can compare to other people, and understanding kind of the unit cost of production is really nice when we create an enterprise budget, because then you can find out, wow, it takes me $3.50 to produce a bushel and it takes you $1. What am I doing that is making it so much more expensive to produce that same bushel when we're selling into the same market? So that means you're just recovering all of those costs or all of that margin, and I'm not. So anyway, those are all important questions to think about. Okay, so I'm going to go through an example here with steer calves. So here are my revenues, right? That's our first part. And I'm selling on a per pound basis, but I want my enterprise budget in a per head basis, because that's how I want to think about it, because I want to understand how many head I should run in order to be profitable. And so I'm going to sell 0.98% of that one head because I have a 2% death loss. That's confusing, right, at the first, because you're like, you can't sell 0.98 of a cow, but when we carry that over a lot of animals, that'll account for that. We have our average weight, our price per pound, and then we can get our revenues in a dollar per head basis. Thinking about our markets, you know, with the folks we're working with or ourselves, are these contracted prices, market prices? Do the same enterprise, do we sell into different markets, you know, so we can make a line for each revenue in our spreadsheet. Okay, costs. Also, how are we doing? We're in the heart of it. We've got maybe 5 more slides until a respite. We're doing okay? Hanging in there? Okay, it's a lot. So cool. Okay, so now we have our costs, which are gonna be, this is like something you could pull out of QuickBooks, basically. So we have our steer calves and we bought them in March and we ran them till September. And these are all of the costs per head that we have through the year, right? So I fed them and I calculated that. I had salt and mineral and I calculated that on a per head basis. And then I just figured out for each month what I was paying. And this can be a trick, right? But sometimes it's easier to do this on the per month because I just wrote it down and it was in QuickBooks, or maybe it's on a per year. I just can figure out, you know, this is how much I put into the animals on a variable cost way, and then divide that total number by the number of animals I had. That's another great method as well. We end up here with this $504, right? That's our total expenditure. That's our total cost for these stocker cows. Sorry, total variable cost. Now we have to understand our fixed cost. And so maybe you'll remember that I said we have like this tractor or this truck, right? We're driving around, we're using for a lot of enterprises. How do we deal with that? So this is what we're going to do. We take the total cost of maintenance or depreciation or whatever it is for those fixed costs that are just part of the operation. And we're going to say, I use about 20% for my stocker business, and I use about 40% of my infrastructure for my stocker business. And then we'll just attribute 20% of that total cost to this enterprise. Does that make sense? So the 20% of that total cost, $5,000, we're going to attribute $1,000 of that to this business, right? And then I can say I'm running 300 head, and then I can calculate a per head just by dividing that 1,000 by 300. So now I know what the fixed cost is for each enterprise and my variable costs. So man, we're awfully close. So 720 per head of fixed costs, 504 per head of variable costs, and 700 and something for revenues. Okay, we're there. We've got an enterprise budget for one enterprise. Oh shoot, that was hard, but now we have it. So now we can just change numbers and it's there. And I'm gonna give you guys a folder. I think I shared it. It should be like a Google folder with some resources with spreadsheets that have a lot of this stuff built in already. So we've got our revenues up here, that's 712. Got our total operating costs. I'll point out interest on operating capital. If you have a loan, right, you'll want to put interest on that operating loan into a variable cost per animal. That's some advanced stuff. I probably should have left it out, but that's okay. This is recorded, so we can go back to it. I'll send everybody these slides. So a note here on what the bottom line is. So why does the bottom line not just say net income, right? We calculated our revenues, we figured out our operating costs, we figured out our fixed costs, right? That's that 720 on machinery and equipment. Why on earth is it not just net income? Because when we have a ranch or a farm there are many things that we're just not going to be able to figure out the costs of. One of which oftentimes is land. Land was inherited, or land was is way too expensive to ever be part of the enterprises, but we just take it as a given. And so if we're leasing land, that's a little different, but oftentimes we'll build these budgets so it's a return to these fixed things like management time, land, and risk. And you'll see those return to management, land, and risk often, because those are things that are much harder to find the costs of. And so we just leave them as a return to those things. And so we can keep that as a return to overhead and not calculate any fixed costs, right? So that's what we do here, that $188. Or we can, once we've attributed and found our fixed costs, we can subtract that and just have returns to management, land, and risk. That's a lot, but it'll hopefully come back. We'll do this a couple times and it'll make sense. Couple notes. This is hard to do accurately. Calculating costs is really hard to figure out sometimes. And a lot of times you have to guess, and it's okay to guess. Economists guess all the time. Just make your guesses as consistent as possible. Like that's the best thing that you can do, is just be consistent across time. Brett asks, is there a benefit to consider solar would take land used for grazing? Exactly, Brett. So this idea between enterprises is that solar would be an enterprise. And I'll encourage you to go back through and hopefully we can get you the recording. But when we're thinking about these different enterprises, solar would be one, and we'll understand the trade-offs where that might be a really nice revenue source for solar on the property. And so let's think about the contribution per acre there versus the contribution per acre of grazing, for instance, or farming. No worries about being late. We had all sorts of technical issues. But we're all here having fun, learning about numbers. And then when we think about this return to management, land, and risk, right? So now I'm thinking about opportunity cost, right? Because I'm making $180 back to management, land, and risk. If I put my management, my land, and my risk into some other enterprise, would I make more than $180? Would I make less? And that's how we can make decisions, right? Because now we can compare things without having to go through all of the difficulty of trying to attribute costs to every little thing and all that kind of thing. And then I encourage everybody to write down which enterprises take the most time, the most energy, the most risk, and most capital, just qualitatively, right? Because if you know that, then when you see that it's $180 return for one enterprise and $120 for the other enterprise, but one takes so much more energy or so much more capital, then you can say, oh man, maybe I should go with that other enterprise or something like that. Okay, so let's do a couple of practices of these and just play with it for a minute here. So revenues, $750 per head for these steers. My costs, calculated, it's $650 per head. My fixed costs are $40 a head, and I get $60 a head return to land management and risk for my feeder steers. I go out and I calculate that. And then I go and I calculate my alfalfa cutting, and I realize I got $350 an acre revenues, $290 an acre in costs, and my returns are $20 an acre. Shit, what do I do now? How do I compare? I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss. Dang it. Oh well, too late. What do I do now? I've got $20 an acre and $60 a head. How do I compare that, right? And so that brings us back to why units matter. and maybe I can calculate a per acre cost on my feeder steers. Maybe I can't, and maybe I need to try to convert my alfalfa cutting to a per head, or maybe I'll take them both, calculate them, and make them total costs, total revenues, and which is going to be part of the process anyway when we think about building a whole ranch kind of accounting system. And so you know, that would be an easy next step, is calculate how many acres you have, and you know, figure out the alfalfa revenues or returns, figure out how many head you have, and figure out the feeder steer returns, and put them together. And I have this in here too, because at this point you should be asking questions about which of these is taking more time, taking more risk, impacting soil health more, etc., etc. Because we have the numbers, but now we need to understand those other parts of that triple bottom line, the other parts of our objective that are not just finances. And then we can start to understand the trade-offs. Okay, so let's do it where it's a little easier here, where they're both in the same units, right? We've got a feeder steers and a cow-calf enterprise. And we calculate this all out, and they're both gaining $60 a head. What do we do now? How do we figure this out? And in the interest of time, I was going to make you guys answer this question, but I'm going to cheat.
Oh wait, so
Okay.
And this may be going in a different direction, but it does come up. So let's say you wanted to expand a little bit. This is how you could use this, because your marginal
Right.
change would affect
Right.
this. That if you were like, I want to expand, but I only have this much money, you could be like, oh, well, adding a new cow-calf pair only costs me $13, and adding feeder steers costs me $14. And then you
Right.
Okay. So am I following?
Yep, you're totally following. That's great. And that's why we build these per unit enterprise budgets first. And then it's so easy in Excel. You just go through and you say, well, I have 300 head. Boom, that's their total revenues or total costs. Whereas if you build it from that total cost first, it's way harder to go backwards. But it's really easy to build up to total costs and total revenues and things like that. And you're exactly right. That's how we get these marginal analyses. And that's how we'll use these values for partial budgeting, which we'll hopefully get to here in a second. And so it is really that, exactly that comparison. And I think actually I have that example on the next slide, or maybe I already talked about the 401 pairs, I think, with Stephanie. Anyway, okay, so here's our example. This ranch, their objective, the enterprise budgets we just had, their objective is to maximize on-farm profit, minimize management time, and maintain their in-town job. Seems reasonable, right? They're also hoping to manage their property for soil health. They're interested in the regenerative thing, and so these are kind of their objectives that we've worked out in the planning process with them. So, So when we compare these two, these are the kind of notes to have, right? Well, steers, they carry more price risk. The prices typically can be a little more volatile than calf prices, but they can run 500 steers if they do it just for the summer grazing season. But they're going to need better fences, which is going to be more capital investment if they choose steers. And it takes more management time, and they don't really have that much time. Where the pairs, it's higher capital costs, and so they're going to need a bigger initial loan from the bank, or they are going to just have to carry more risk in that capital, but it's going to be less labor for most of the summer, but also they can only run 350 pairs. So when we have like these sorts of questions, it's not a simple answer. It's not this is what we do, but it is, we can get a little closer, right? We can start to articulate, okay, our returns are the same per head, but now I can calculate 60 times 500 to understand my returns. If I run all 500 steers, I can multiply that 60 by 350. And the difference, I can see if that difference is made up for in the management time problem or the soil health problem or whatever the problem is. You can understand those trade-offs a little better. Does that make sense and seem like it might be true, that it might help articulate those trade-offs? I hope so. Okay, so summarizing enterprise analysis. We've got vertical versus horizontal enterprise comparison, which I didn't get into vertical integration a bunch. That could be a whole other thing we could talk about on how to compare like the marginal benefit of each enterprise that's vertically stacked. But understanding unit cost of production. If I know it takes me $300 a head to get that calf, and it takes everybody else $200 a head, I might need to change something in my system. And then comparing the contribution of an enterprise to my overall objective. Those are the three things I hope that you can gather from enterprise analysis, as well as some of the tools that I'll share that you can play around with. Palette cleansing slide. I love these ones.
What's this? What's this a photo of?
This is also our ranch
so
that we're on. Yeah. Eva asked, return to LMR. Oh, that's return to land management and risk, right? So those are return to those objects that we did not want to figure out the costs of because they're very hard to cost. So we just say it's a return to those things because then we can still compare between enterprises, but we didn't have to calculate like how much per head is the value of my land is that steer using. Things like that, they're really hard to figure out. Or how much management time. You might be able to figure out how much labor, but how much like managerial type time is attributable to one animal. Those sorts of things are really hard to figure out. So we just leave it. Any other questions here before we jump into partial budgeting for the last 15 minutes? You guys are doing great, hanging in there. Started late. I'm going to try to get us off early, or get us off like right on time. Great. Goodbye. Beautiful slide. And on to partial budgeting. Kate laughed in the other room at my vigor and enthusiasm around topics that are typically seen as boring, but I think are great. So you'll also hear partial budgeting known as T-charts. NRCS likes to call them T-charts. Other people will as well. So this is where we're going to take our enterprise analysis. We're going to take some of our economic jargon and we're going to put it into a tool that is very applicable to what we're all doing, hopefully. And there we go. So what is it? It's a tool to analyze a decision that will affect multiple enterprises. So what we can do with partial budgeting is we'll take an option, some decision we have to make, and we'll map it. We're going to map all the benefits, we're going to map all the costs, and it can be a decision like buying a new truck for all of our enterprises, or it can be changing my soil management practices. It can be putting in a new fence, really anything on the ranch that there's a decision to make. Partial budgeting is a tool to allow us to understand it a little better. So typical use cases are going to be like choosing between inputs. If I want to be like minimize my inputs or buy a bunch of nitrogen for my soil, if I'm changing management practices, we can use it for marketing channels and kind of all similar to a SWOT, right? We can use it on all three of those circles. This is a Latin term. It'll make you sound really smart. Just kidding. It'll make you sound like a snooty economist, but it's ceteris paribus, and we use it all the time, which it comes from the math behind optimization problems, where we change one thing and we're keeping everything else equal. Partial budgeting is the idea of, I don't want to understand how this is going to impact every little piece of my, how all of my things are moving at once. I just want to imagine if everything else stays the same, but I build this new fence line, how is that going to change my income? Again, the world doesn't work that way. Things move around together all the time, right? But it's a helpful tool. So how do we do it? We're going to identify a status quo, right? We need to know what we're doing already. This is really what our plans are about, right? We're identifying what folks are doing already, and then we're going to identify what the alternative is. Is there an alternative practice or an alternative place for a fence or whatever it is? What changes are associated to that alternative in terms of costs, in terms of revenues, and then so we'll go over each 4 of these, but it'll be new additional costs from the alternative, current costs that'll be reduced from that alternative, new additional revenue, and current revenue to be reduced. I'm going to go over that a bunch of times, so you'll see it again. This I stole from Marshall Fraser, a professor in our department. This is our partial budget. Okay, this is our format that we use, and this is why they're called T-charts, as you can tell, because they look like T's. I think these headphones are gonna die, so let us.
All right. You still hear me? Great. So our status quo, so here we are. Increased revenues and decreased costs on the left. Those are good things that come from our alternative change, right? Our happy faces are on the left because we're increasing revenues from that change, and we're decreasing some costs possibly from that change. On our other side, we might have additional costs from that practice and decreased revenues. And then we're just going to sum those 2 columns. Total good minus total bad is our incremental profit from that change. So let's go through an example. I think that's the best way to understand it. So our status quo is that we have an old hay field where it's, alfalfa, oats, brome, Kentucky bluegrass, and we cut it every year. And then our alternative is we heard that the NRCS is doing this thing where they'll pay us to put cover crops in and we can graze it so we don't have to bale it, right? That'd be kind of cool. But we're trying to figure out how that'll impact, like whether we should actually do it. And so what we have to do is we have to think about how is it going to increase my revenue? How is it going to decrease my existing costs? Is it going to am I going to incur new costs because of that change? And is it going to decrease existing revenue because of that change? So the first thing we start with doing is just write it all out, right? It's just what happens. And so we won't put any numbers with it. It'll just be the thing, right? So we're going to get an NRCS payment for doing that practice. We're going to get a grazing fee from our neighbors who want to graze it off for us, and they're going to pay us. We're going to have decreased costs because we're not going to have to harvest that ground anymore each year. We're going to have increased costs because we have to buy the seed mix. We have to do the no-till drill rental. We have to maybe spray if we're going to spray the existing crop before we no-till it, which is a common practice. And we have to have time with the NRCS, which all of us know might be a little more than we had anticipated, filling out paperwork and things like that. And then how does it decrease our revenue? Well, we're no longer going to be able to sell that baled alfalfa that we used to bale. So now the goal is to just articulate all of these and see if it makes sense, right? So let's do that. So NRCS, we've got $52 an acre and a grazing fee of $22 an acre that our neighbor is going to pay us. And our decreased costs are going to be $100 an acre. We calculated with our enterprise budget, that's how much it costs us to harvest and that hay, right? That's the kind of the variable costs, or the total cost for doing all of that. So that's the total good on the left. the bad is that we're going to have, incurred costs, right? So the seed is $15 an acre, the Roundup, no-till drill rental, labor and time. We figure that out. And then we also have our decreased revenue. We're not going to make those hay bale sales anymore. So we total up everything on the left, $172 an acre is our positive change, and $190 an acre is our negative change. So that's a loss of $8 an acre on this decision, given kind of all of these factors. Whoa, Reid. Whoa. Yeah, see, that's his horse going. Anyway, well, what do we do with that? Right? It's $8 an acre that we lost. What does that mean? Do we not do it? Should we do it? And what about following years? What about maybe there's different seed options? Maybe there's non-financial benefits. And I would say to all of these questions, nice questions. I agree. Let's think about it, right? Because $8 an acre of a loss might be worth it if we're increasing our soil organic carbon content and we're saving fuel, and we no longer have, risk associated to owning all this equipment, and we don't have to sit in the tractor and sweat all summer because we're worried that it's going to rain on our alfalfa after we cut it, and et cetera, et cetera. So again, all of this is about trade-offs. Finances are the first piece, and then articulating what other benefits are the second piece. And an important note here, a lot of this, like partial budgeting, is very much a snapshot in time, right? But we know that farming and ranching is a long-term thing. And so trying to articulate long-term changes is an important part that this tool doesn't really allow us to do. So just note that. One thing I wanted to talk about is the NRCS has all of these articulated already. So for every practice they have the positive effects and the negative effects laid out. And I'll give you the link to that at the end here, but and this is non-financial, right? They try to articulate all the soil, water, capital risk. So these are a really nice tool to go in and basically build out your mental partial budget from this. And then you can try to figure out which of these are financial and which of these aren't. And maybe we can make a partial budget based on the information we know. Or maybe we can just kind of have a mind version of it, right? Where we know what the revenues or the benefits are, and we know what the costs are. Maybe we don't attribute a per acre dollar amount to it, and that's fine. A partial budget is just the start, as I emphasized. There are non-market costs and benefits, time horizons matter, and everything else isn't constant. And so these are all notes, but to have, but I think it's a really neat and important tool to use to help articulate what a change might do to somebody's income streams. Oops, we're not to that palate cleanser quite yet. So we have 3 minutes left today, so I'm actually going to skip over this, but I want you guys, as your homework assignment, is to go and figure out an example of a status quo, some practice, figure out the alternative, and then just write out all of the potential increases in revenue, potential decreased costs, the increased costs and the decreased revenue. Use the link I'll share with you here at the end from the NRCS, and go check that out. And I don't know, I think it'll be a useful activity, and you can screenshot this, or I'll send you the Google folder that'll have a partial budget spreadsheet in it already. So you can use that one if that's easier. It's our final palate cleansing picture of a bunch of sheep butts at sunrise many years ago in Idaho. I'm not saying that you're all sheep. I just want you to know that I was worried about putting this in here because sometimes, it's just a pretty picture. There's no commentary on sheep. I feel like there's a lot of commentary on sheep these days, which I don't like. Okay, Eva has a real question. So partial budgeting is another way to decide between different enterprises. No, partial budgeting is not a way to decide between enterprises. It's a way to decide about a management practice change. So, well, I guess you could use it for enterprises. I would say the enterprise analysis is the first step to getting an accurate partial budget. You're not going to be able to know your status quo unless you unless you have an accurate enterprise budget to start.
That's super helpful. Okay, great.
Yep. So we start there, we figure out our costs, we do that work. And then once we do, then we can use that partial budget as a what if scenario. So exactly like that change that you mentioned of what happens if I raise 10 more cows, can I do that? That would be kind of an example of a partial budget type idea. Cool. So to sum up, we've got kind of our 3 topic areas we talked about today: economics, enterprise budgets, and partial budgets. The thing I want you to think about from economics is that there's language around decision making that can be useful, topics and things. And so hopefully, you feel a little more familiar with that language. The other thing is really a huge part of it is, if I do this, then what? And that's really what economics is about. And we'll never know. The world is really hard to forecast and to know what'll happen, but if we're strategic, I think we can get close. And then what is optimal, and how that depends on what our objective is, and how our objective does not have to be financial. But we should figure out the financial piece first to then understand those other bits that are not financial. Enterprise budgets, it's a contribution to the whole, and we're comparing costs and revenues within and outside the operation. So we're figuring out kind of what is my per head production cost, or per acre, so I can compare enterprises amongst the ones that I'm managing, and I'm comparing to my neighbors who are somehow doing it way cheaper than me, or somehow I'm doing it way cheaper than them, right? That's a really important part of it, because especially if you're a price taker. Last part on partial budgeting, we're understanding the benefits and the costs of a change, and we're articulating the financial and ecological impacts of changes simultaneously, right? So we're using those partial budgets to figure out the financial bit while thinking what else is in this box of that T chart. Skills, these are some things, if you guys are interested in kind of continuing to build on this, these are kind of the skills associated to what we talked about today. Identifying the trade-offs, right? So that's why I want you guys to go do that by yourself, figuring out the benefits. It can be really hard to do, but those the NRCS resources are really useful to start. Articulating the value of non-dollar valued aspects of farming and ranching. So things like soil health, water quality, quality of life. That's our job, is if we calculate these enterprise budgets and it's in the red, but we still think it's really valuable, our job is to articulate that value in a way that says, this is worth $8 an acre, I promise. And it's on us to develop the knowledge of the system and build the rapport to articulate that. And hopefully we find that it's in the black. The last one is the creativity associated to non-traditional enterprises. I think it was Brett that mentioned the solar panels, right? So things like that, creativity of understanding what new enterprises could we put on this place to diversify risk, or maybe capture more margin if they're vertical. And then understanding standard unit costs of production for the area. That's a really nice thing to do, of like, once you calculate an enterprise budget and you're like, whoa, actually, Stephanie, your cost of production on your calves is way higher than it should be. Let's figure out why. And the only way to know that is to really know your area, because it's going to depend. So here are some resources. Let's see. I was gonna, oops. Let me just put these in the chat here. So Extension will have local enterprise budgets for you. And so check those out to compare and see examples of them for different enterprises. And then those practice cost benefit templates are there. There's a spreadsheet that the NRCS has that has all of the benefits and costs for all of their practices enumerated in a different way, called that CPPE spreadsheet. So you can check that out on that link. And then the last one, that cover crop economics PDF, is a really nice example of working through these sorts of questions across time. They do a really nice job of saying, here's what it's like this year. Here's this partial budget for this year. And then how does that look across time? So if you're interested, check that one out. And as always, I'm here to answer questions and help however I can. This is stuff I, of course, think is very important. So that is all. That is all I have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Reid, for putting this together. We will get the recording polished up and sent out to you all soon. And yeah, if there are any other questions, go for it. I have to have another call, but thank you.
And then here is the folder, like in our CCG workshop, but for anybody who wants to check out the folder for like resources where those spreadsheets are and some other things I put into that folder. That's how you get there. Lovely.
That was, I learned so much.
Good. I hope it wasn't too much. I was like, this is gonna be a water hose, but
Good humor too.
Yeah.
Humor helps. Yeah, and I feel like it was a nice bit to just get excited about going deeper, right? Being like, oh, okay, like expanding what I
now you know what to Google, or what, when you see things, you'll know a little bit more of what they're talking about. That was the goal. So yeah, anyway. Brett, I work with those two a lot. Any other questions that you have for me while we're on? Okay, maybe he's gone. That's okay. Sounds good. Well, thanks, Brett, for joining. Reach out to me if you have any questions and you're interested. Check out the recording if you want to see kind of the other parts of the presentation. Maybe I'll upload these PDF or these slides somewhere. Would that be helpful for you two to have these slides? Okay, I'll do that. Okay, go in peace.
Bye.
Take care.
Mhm.